It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. So glad you're joining us for the next 30 minutes or so on this program. If you haven't joined us before, we talk about all things UofL with the exception of athletics. We talk about research, great students, programming, events going on at the University of Louisville. So we hope you get a little bit of information that you can brag about UofL a little bit if you're a UofL supporter, and if not, some information perhaps about some events going on at the University of Louisville. So what have we got coming up on today's show? Well, a UofL archaeologist helped unearth some of the ancient city of Caesarea in Israel. We'll talk to John Hale about the significance of that project and his role in that project. And U.S. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan visited UofL and had what I thought were some pretty provocative comments about women and how their views shape or don't shape the court's decisions, and whether she's an originalist or an activist judge when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. So we'll play you some of Justice Kagan's remarks at the end of this show. But first, some UofL researchers have landed a grant from the NIH to investigate how the environment influences the health of children. What we don't know and sometimes can't see can hurt our kids. Dr. Janice Sullivan is the Chief and Medical Director of the COSARE Charities Pediatric Research Unit at UofL, and Sarah Watson is an Assistant Pediatrics Professor also at UofL. So, Janice and Sarah, thanks for coming on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting us.
All right, well, tell us a little bit about this grant you landed along with, I guess, several other folks across the United States. You're part of it, right? What's the grant? What are you going to do?
So we are one of 17 sites that was selected across the United States as one of the IDEA state grants, and we are going to be working with local physicians, community leaders, etc., to try and identify areas that may impact children's health in the future.
All right, that's Dr. Janice Sullivan, by the way. Sarah, what are some of the things that you're looking at? I mean, when we talk about children's health and environmental hazards or environmental problems that affect their health, what are we talking about? Are we talking about air, water? What are some of the things we're talking about?
Well, a little bit of all of it. There are 4 main focus areas for this grant, and we're going to look at things that affect breathing and disorders in kids, including asthma and even smaller children. We're going to look at prematurity and some issues with babies who are born to mothers addicted to drugs. We're also going to look at obesity and factors that are influencing that in ways to hopefully impact that, and also neurodevelopmental outcomes.
See, when I think of environmental stuff, I think about what's in the air, what's in the water, how's that going to affect my kid? But you're talking about some other factors, right?
Right. Maybe diet, it may be exercise, it could be, just like she mentioned, infants born to mothers addicted to narcotics, and we know that there's been an exponential increase in that in Kentucky over the last 10 years. Also, in looking at neurodevelopmental outcomes, we know that the incidence of autism in Kentucky has markedly increased, and so trying to identify what those factors may be. So there's a lot of different things that may impact the health of children.
Right, and there are things in Kentucky where Kentucky kids have a higher rate of various things. We know about the parents having lung cancer and those kinds of heart disease, those kinds of things because of our health, and we're just not healthy in Kentucky. But the kids are also at higher rates. I think you mentioned autism. I think our autism rates are a little bit higher. Asthma rates, I believe, are a little bit higher. Correct?
Correct.
So aren't there little slivers of Kentucky health with their involving kids that are worse than the national average? Are you going to be looking at those things to see why it's bad here with the kids here?
We are, and I think one of the opportunities with this grant are collaboration with people from other states. And so you can look at what's different about your state, but also try and identify factors that impact development and disease. So I think that's an exciting part of this grant. One of the other faculty members at the University of Louisville, Michelle Stevenson, was part of another group that went in because the IDEA grant is under a big umbrella called the ECHO grants. And so there was some subawards that went in, and she has been doing some work looking at RSV, which is a virus that babies get.
What is it?
It's a respiratory syncytial virus,
okay.
And so when you and I get it, we just end up with a cold.
Okay.
But when little babies get it, they can get very sick and sometimes die from that disease. And so we've been following children with that disease for a long time. So part of this grant they put in to continue to follow those children until they're up to 6 years of age that have been previously enrolled in the study, and to look at the development of asthma. Does having that virus as an infant impact their risk of having asthma later on? So
I got you. We're talking with Dr. Janice Sullivan at the University of Louisville and Sarah Watson, who's an assistant pediatrics professor at UofL. We're talking about a grant that they recently received from the NIH to look at environmental factors and the health of children and how that goes on and affects them in their adulthood. Sarah, what are some of the things that that doctors see in Kentucky, perhaps, that you're going to look at in this study that it may be different, or that they're saying, they're scratching their heads saying, well, why does this kid have this, but this kid doesn't? What are some of the things that they're looking at?
So as you mentioned, there are higher rates of various illnesses in Kentucky, and one of them is obesity that we're seeing a lot more of in Kentucky, which certainly puts our kids at a higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes and other complications. So this grant is going to help us build a network throughout the state to really involve some of the kids that live in more rural areas that aren't near where we're physically located, to allow them to participate in research and really get us to the opportunities to answer these questions. That's one of the things that's more unique about Kentucky than some of the other states that have a much larger urban population.
So is this a rural health grant?
yes, it really is, and I think it's exciting because we are collaborating with the Commonwealth Institute of Kentucky, which is part of the School of Public Health. And they will be helping us reach out to local communities, because we want, on our advisory board for our grant, we are going to involve children and parents and community leaders to kind of help us involve the rural people in Kentucky, the underserved population in Kentucky, to allow them to be part of this initiative as it moves forward.
Is there anything in the air or the water in Kentucky that's any different from it is anywhere else, or in the Ohio Valley for that matter? You talked about asthma, I guess, and my first thought was, well, they live in the Ohio Valley, of course they're going to have more respiratory problems. Is there anything different in Kentucky and southern Indiana than there is in the rest of the country?
So as far as pollutants and things like that, I don't know the answer specifically. We do have a much higher rate of cigarette smoking and therefore smoke exposure for our children.
Secondhand smoke.
Correct. And also we have higher rates of addiction and infants born to mothers with addiction. So those are a couple of specific things, and we might be able to get at some of the other answers.
I think one of the aspects of this is looking at pollutants in the air and asthma, et cetera. And we know now that there are inhalers and things that have GPS on them, basically. So you can identify when a patient uses those inhalers, et cetera, and you can look at air quality and things like that. And there are already people that are working on that. And how much of that will be part of this grant, we will learn when we go to our meeting in Washington, D.C. in the next couple of weeks to kind of meet with all the other groups that are involved, so we have a better groundwork on what we're going to focus on.
I read the news release that came out about your grant, and one thing that I found interesting was that you're looking at factors of not just newborn babies, but in the womb, then newborns, and then up to, you're talking infants here. So you're talking about a very not early child, but early childhood and the impacts that environmental factors can have, aren't you?
Correct.
Is that part of it? Is that a big part of it?
That is part of it. And then some of the other outcomes that affect older children will include those age groups as well. But there is that piece about newborns for sure.
Out of this grant, what do you hope that parents will learn? And what do you hope that doctors will learn? That's a two-part question. Let's start with parents first. What do you hope that parents might be able to learn from the research and what you learned from out of this grant?
I think it's important for parents to gain an understanding of how research is conducted and what role they can have, because I think it's very important if you don't have buy-in from parents and from the children to participate in research and they don't appreciate the potential benefit, that you lose something. And so I think them being able to contribute, even to study design, how is this study going to be done? I think parents will have a vested interest in that. And as a result, I think as when the results of the studies come out, I think parents can be involved and help sharing that information, and they may have a better understanding of how to reach other people and impact long-term outcome.
Right. Sarah, how about doctor? Well, go with parents first, then doctors. What do you think that you hope they learn?
Well, I think she answered the parent question
She
very
did.
well.
She did.
So as far as what I hope doctors learn, I really hope that we learn better how to work with the families and the individuals in these communities to, number one, address their concerns and to ask the questions that will have the greatest impact on their health, and also to take into account some of the barriers that they might have to being willing to or being physically able to participate in research and really change how we are doing our jobs to better serve them.
Gotcha. Very good. All right, Janice Sullivan, Sarah Watson, congratulations on the NIH grant, and we hope to hear more about this in the future, about what you find in your research. The ancient city of Caesarea was built along the coast of what is now Israel in 10 BC by Herod the Great, and the ruins of Caesarea are now a national park, but only after they were unearthed by an international team of archaeologists, including one of those guys from the University of Louisville. John Hale is that guy. He's also the director of the Liberal Studies program at UofL. John, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Morning, Mark.
How you doing?
Good to be here.
Good to see you. And you didn't die in any of your excavations or do anything crazy. You don't have a broken leg or anything. That's good.
I do plenty of crazy things, but they've not led to mortal injury so far.
That's good.
Keep praying.
All right. So, what do you teach at UofL? First off, let's give that to the folks.
Well, the
that are
current
listening.
courses are both relevant to Caesarea. One is a big underwater archaeology lecture course, and the other is a course for the honors program, a 16-student seminar on the Roman Empire and its infrastructure. So talking about giant concrete-built harbors built with Roman concrete and built by Roman concrete engineers for King Herod is very relevant to that seminar.
Right. So that's what we're going to talk about here in just a second. So tell us about Caesarea. For those who don't know where it is or what it is, why don't you explain it?
Well, the coast of what is today Israel, the Holy Land, has not one natural harbor. So when King Herod the Great came to rule and wanted to make his small country an international player, and he thought very much in those terms, he persuaded his buddy, Caesar Augustus of Rome, the new emperor. They'd known each other when they were teenagers, to send him 150 shiploads of Roman hydraulic concrete mix, the Roman engineers to do it right, and they created these two huge jetties, arms of hydraulic concrete that run out into the sea, into the Mediterranean, and enclosed a double harbor, huge lighthouse, wharfs, warehouses, fortifications, everything. And what they weren't aware of, because there were no natural harbors to let them know this, is regularly tsunamis hit that coast. And they've got to reach the whole length of the Med, all the way from Sicily. It's open water. So gradually through the centuries, that magnificent harbor lost its lighthouse, and the jetties were either submerged or broken up into these jagged little islets of Roman concrete, which are still there but are now great hazards to navigation. So the first phase was studying and reconstructing the harbor. That was before I got there. But then dealing with all the shipwrecks from later periods that tried to enter that harbor through those slots and were wrecked.
Right. And so what happened after King Herod was gone? What happened with this? Obviously, it was destroyed partially destroyed by the weather, but what?
Well, it remained a very important port for the Byzantine period. Then when the Islamic Jihad made that part of the world of Islam, it became an important port then. And then it was in contention because early on, the Islamic people regarded Jerusalem as an open city. And Charlemagne, way over in France in the year 800, decided to send builders over to create a Christian hostel for pilgrims at Caesarea because that was the landing point for pilgrims who were then going to make the long overland trek to Jerusalem up in the hills. So it went on being a center of shipping, a center of religious fervor, a center of international interest for centuries.
All right, and then talk about, so for centuries and centuries, this city still exists. Eventually it's washed away, covered, buried, whatever happens to it. So then how did a group of international archaeologists come to say, you know what, let's go unearth that baby? What happened?
Well, archaeologists are always looking for sites that haven't been built on top of. You try to do early London or Paris, and you've got thousands of tons of modern cities sitting over what you want to investigate. But on a sea coast, and especially a place that was repeatedly abandoned, you've got things under sand dunes. You've got things in shallow water, very accessible. Because of the jagged remains of that giant artificial harbor the Romans built, it was not a deep water port for anybody. So it didn't undergo that industrialization that would have destroyed or blanketed over the archaeological remains. It was actually an American couple. They were part of the DuPont family, and they used their money for science. They created a thing they called Sea Diver, a sort of acrylic bubble that they could go down in. They worked on Port Royal, a sunken pirate city in Jamaica. Then they went over to Israel, and they took the first photos of Caesarea from underwater.
And when was that?
That was in the 50s.
Okay.
And after that, it was on everybody's radar screen, including, of course, Nation of Israel, as something that needed to be, A, protected, but B, studied. So that's when the archaeology got going.
We're talking with John Hale, who's an archaeology professor at the University of Louisville and has been over at Caesarea and done some work over there. So what did you do?
I'm an underwater archaeologist, so I am interested in recovering and mapping and documenting everything you find on the seafloor that's the result of human presence. Well, at Caesarea, it's the early times over there was working with groups of students, mainly from University of Rhode Island. They've got a big program there. My colleague Bridget Buxton works there. Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, his academic position now is at University of Rhode Island Oceanographic. So that means we had access to the greatest underwater mechanisms and technology that's out there right now. So early on, we were mapping the harbor and what was left to sort of millimeter kind of accuracy. But then, by chance, 2 years ago, a sport diver noticed what he thought were little yellow checkers from a kid's game, plastic things he thought were lying down on the harbor floor when he was scuba diving. And by the time he picked the fifth one up, he and his buddies realized these are gold coins.
Oh, wow.
And so that led to the identification of a 1,000-year-old shipwreck, came up from Cairo in Egypt, an official ship of the Caliph of Egypt, a gold treasure ship because Jerusalem, which was part of the Caliph's empire, had just shaken down in an earthquake, and he was sending fleets of ships with men and material and money to rebuild the city. And this one didn't make it. It hit those rocky or concrete islands, sank, and by the time 4,000 of these coins had been found, I would have been happy to have one pot or something from the wreck, which we didn't even have the wreck at that point. At that point, it could have all just been a big sack of money that fell overboard or was deliberately dropped.
Right.
People sometimes in times of crisis will deposit, and we bless them for it as archaeologists, hoards. They'll take all their wealth and they'll bury it or they'll sink it in the sea, mark the spot in their own mind, and then intending after the chaos and the military crisis is over to go back. Well, other places along the coast had these, but finally, on the last day that I was there, we did find the ship's anchor, great big iron thing, clearly from about 1,000 years ago, and a lovely iron spike that had gone through the planking of the ship. And it had gold coins concreted to it at either end in the rust. So
that's
it's clearly part of the shipwreck. Mission accomplished. That was very, very beautiful.
So you found that wreck. Did you get to do any more work on it to go dig around?
Well, there was no more work.
That was it, huh?
They have now, the whole bottom of the harbor is now this rubble, broken concrete, Roman concrete. And certainly if there were 4,000 accessible gold coins, I mean, these things are as thin as paper. More of them will have slipped down. But those that have been found, that we found, they've all been taken over to the Jerusalem Museum. They're coming to the Metropolitan Art Museum in New York sometime soon, so Americans can see them too. But we moved on this year to another shipwreck discovery, this one found by a couple of fishermen. It was closer into shore and a little up the coast, and it was a place where an earlier ship, 700 years earlier, Roman ship in the year 300, bringing a cargo of bronzes, bronze statues, bronze lamps. It hit the rocks, sank, and nobody salvaged the stuff. So it's the only time I've ever dived where every dive, all you need to do is wave your hand over the sand on the seafloor, and you're going to see bronze.
You're going to find something.
Yeah, there were Statue of Liberty-like bronze women that were the handles for huge lamps. There seemed to be the broken up bits of a statue of one of the emperors, maybe Hadrian.
So what's the feeling? You're down underwater, say 40 feet underwater, whatever you are, in the ocean, essentially in the Mediterranean Sea, and you see something like that. What's the feeling that goes through? Is it a rush, or what happens to you?
When you're doing it, you've got to execute a mission. You've got to document everything about that and not forget to take the right photos, to document the exact position, to get it into the container that it will make sure it doesn't get lost between where you found it and the dock where you're coming back to. Because nothing is worse than having taken a photo, show up, and, oh, damn, I left it. So that's...
So you're all business. You're pretty much all business.
It's like what you're doing right now. This is a job.
Yeah.
I'm here enjoying myself talking to you.
Right.
You have many things on your mind.
Right.
So it, I think the excitement comes afterwards when you're back in the headquarters and you start to lay the stuff out, get it washed off, really see exactly what you've got, all the details on it. One of the big finds, although it seems silly, was I was out with the head of Israel's underwater archaeology program, Kobe Sharvit, and he pointed it to a little mound of what looked to me like it might be bronze, but underwater you've only got the blue-green spectrum, so colors just don't come out. But he kept pointing at it, and he was getting out his movie camera, so I knew, well, it's got to be important. So I'm fanning my hand over it, and he gets impatient with me and reaches in and fans the sand off faster to expose it, and finally he's pointing, so I realize there's a big, long chain there. And so I start picking up the chain, and it's ancient. It's handmade chain, bronze wire, tied and twisted, link after link coming up from the sand, the seafloor. And when I get it so it's a yard long, I look down, and the biggest fish hook I've ever seen in my life is attached to the bottom. He got his pictures. We got it back to the shore, and all the local fishermen came around to see it and said, well, that's a shark fishing hook.
Wow.
Because sharks can bite through line, but they can't bite through metal.
Right.
And we still put steel wire if we're going after sharks instead of line. So it was instantly identified by the local fishermen.
That's pretty cool.
Who still use the descendant of that Roman technology.
Got about a minute left here. I want to ask you, how do you use these excavations and these missions that you go on in your classroom? How do you share this with your students?
Well, we all share all the photos we have, and the Israeli Underwater Archaeological Authority are taking film all the time, movies, video while we're down there. So there's a lot to show. And if I'm doing a course like underwater archaeology, then this fits right in. I can talk not just about the finds, but about all the technology that's used, the people involved. Archaeology is all about teams. So we look at the conservators who work with the material we find. We look at the remote sensing experts that are out there with the sonar, seeing how far the site extends. So for underwater, it's fine. My other big lecture course, Archaeology of Sacred Sites, Caesarea was a pilgrimage center. There were temples there. So we can tie in the fact that people are coming there for religious reasons to include this material in the lecture at UofL.
Very good. John Hale, it's always fun talking to you, brother.
Good to talk with you.
Good to see you.
Till next time.
Until next time. That's right. Justice Elena Kagan is the most recent member of the U.S. Supreme Court, and she's a native New Yorker, and she was in Louisville to pick up an award from the UofL Law School for her life of public service. But Justice Kagan also answered questions from two law school faculty members, offering a candid look at the court, her colleagues, and how she views her interpretation of the U.S. Constitution in modern times. Here are some of the remarks she made during that program.
You know, there are only 9 of us now. There were only 8 of us doing this one thing. Nobody else really gets what we do in the same way that we do. So I think everybody focuses on how we disagree sometimes, and we write sharp dissents sometimes. But what they don't get is that there is this incredible personal bond that comes out of being one of a very few people that do something together that nobody else really has access to or sort of understands in the same way. And the Chief Justice, I think, is really terrific with respect to this, that he, understands how important collegiality is to the workings of a court.
Well, one of the collegial traditions is that after a conference vote with your colleagues, then all of you go to lunch together.
Yeah.
Even if it's just been a vote that you might be disappointed about the outcome of that vote. Have you ever not wanted to go to lunch after a conference?
Well, I guess there's two questions. Have I ever not wanted, and have I ever not gone? Because I don't think you'd be human if sometimes you didn't think, oh, I'd really rather just go back to my office and punch a wall or something. But in fact, I've never not gone.
How would you classify your judicial philosophy? Do you characterize yourself as an originalist or an activist? None of the above?
Definitely neither of those two. Yeah, I'm not an originalist. I don't think that the way we interpret our Constitution now is necessarily the same as the way somebody did in 1789 or in 1868. So I think it would be sort of a betrayal of the kind of Constitution that they wrote to be a strict originalist, meaning to just say, well, when they said equal protection of the laws, what did that mean? Did it mean, was that consistent with segregated schools? Yes, it absolutely was consistent with segregated schools in their minds in 1868. Does that mean that we're stuck with segregated schools? No, it can't possibly mean that, because they wrote a Constitution that didn't talk in specifics, that talked in generalities, understanding that a Constitution was meant to be for the ages, and that what counted were the principles and not the specific applications. There are lots of things that Justice Ginsburg and Justice Sotomayor and I agree on, but I don't tend to think that it has anything to do with being women. I think, another president could appoint another woman and she would disagree on all kinds of things with me. So I guess I don't think that women bring any special perspective for most of our cases.
I was wondering, what do you miss about Justice Scalia?
I miss all kinds of things about Justice Scalia. He took me to his gun club, and he taught me to shoot, and he taught me gun safety, and we did that for a couple of times, and we started going hunting together. It turns out I liked it. Turns out, I'm a very competitive person, And if you put a gun in my hand and you said the object is to shoot things, it's like, okay, I'm on it,
That was U.S. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan after receiving an award from the Brandeis School of Law at UofL, which, by the way, was named one of the top 30 best value law schools in the country again this year by Pre-Law Magazine. So congratulations to them. Thank you all for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville, and go Cards.